Good morning and welcome to our Coffee and Conversation session series that we have going on here at the MSBA. We're joined today by Senator Will Smith, and I will turn it over to Bobby Zirkin to give us some more details and start the conversation.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Conversations. I am very pleased and proud to be here with my very good friend, Will Smith, Senator from Montgomery County and the chairman of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. When I was in the General Assembly, he was my vice chairman and absolutely a stellar legislator. And we are excited again to have him here. He's an attorney and chairs an incredibly important committee down in Annapolis, and here to talk about the elections and what's coming up in this next legislative session and so forth. So Will, welcome again.
Hey, good morning. Always good to be here with you, and always good to. I wish we were in person, but it's always good to be here with you. Wearing a fellow, I like the sweatshirt here. I got my sweatshirt going on. It's good stuff. No, but honestly, thank you for having me, and it's always a good time here. I've learned a tremendous amount from you, and I continue to learn a lot from you. And I think that the relationship between our committee, the Judicial Proceedings Committee, and the MSBA is going to be even more important as we go forward in the next legislative session. We've got a number of new legislators and people with varying degrees of expertise. And so we'll rely on members of the bar for assistance as we navigate the legislative terrain in the next session. So really appreciative and thankful to be here.
All right, well, great to see you. Let's jump right into it. So we just a couple days ago finished the elections, and let's just focus on Maryland. Obviously, there's a lot of things going on around the country, but here in Maryland, a lot of change coming both at the executive level and the legislative level. So how do you see what just happened kind of affecting the state? I know that's a broad question, and more specifically, how is it going to affect your committee?
Well, obviously, this was a historic election for many reasons. Every statewide constitutional office was up, meaning there was going to be a new occupant. So from the comptroller, which you have our first woman to occupy the comptroller's office in Brooke Learman, you have your first African-American to occupy the attorney general's office, and you have your first African-American governor in Wes Moore. So Anthony Brown, Wes Moore, Brooke Learman, all historical figures coming in at a moment of broad change, not only for those statewide offices, but also in the General Assembly. We have a significant amount of turnover in the House and the Senate. In the Senate, we netted, the Democrats, when I say we, the Democrats netted two seats. So that's a significant shift. I think that's the first time in over 30 years that Democrats will now have that level of majority in the Senate, and in the House, I think they gained 2 or 3 seats as well. So you have single party control of every tier of government in Annapolis. And so I think that's going to be just fundamentally different than what we've been experiencing for the last 8 years. And that's, I think that's a good thing and it's a bad thing in some respects. And so we'll see how it goes. It's definitely historic though, for sure.
We'll talk about that a little bit. When you say that you think it's a good thing and a bad thing, tell me kind of what do you mean by that? Like, how is it, do you think that, I know that there were some bills that came out that maybe got moderated because of the second floor. Is that the concern, or how do you see things playing out with a new administration like this?
No, so it's good because from my perspective, I think we'll be able to push a lot of the priorities that, personally align with my personal politics and policy goals. And I think that's good. And obviously the people of Maryland have spoken. And so this is the government that they've returned. But, the system that we have, not only the bicameral legislature, but then also the 3 branches of government, it's an invitation to struggle and to deliberate and to have full-throated conversations about policy. And when you have single party control, there is chance that full-throated analysis and that full scope debate doesn't happen at the level that it probably should. Especially when you're, and in my committee, that's even more important. One thing that I've always respected about you and that I've tried to carry on is that you basically just depoliticize the process in JPR, because the issues are so important that it's not really a Democratic or a Republican issue. It's something that you've got to take every issue on its merits. And so, my hope is that the politics don't seep into it, and we just continue that tradition of being a rigorous committee that produces, I'm committed to this, that produces just quality product. And so, yeah, you're right. There's a check on the second floor, My analysis was never 24, which is what you need to get a bill passed in the Senate. It was always 29 because we would have to override a veto. And so if the policy didn't shift to gather that 29, then it just wasn't going to happen. That dynamic doesn't exist anymore. Now there's going to be pressure to just put something out. You've got 24, go, go, go. And maybe the governor won't veto it. So it's just an altogether different dynamic. And I think it's going to force a lot of difficult conversations.
Interesting. All right. Well, you have, and then just before we get off the election, you've lost a few members, valued members of JPR running for different offices, maybe others that are going to other committees. Can you speak to that and maybe how the committee dynamic shifts because of that?
No, so two of note. I mean, and they're Republicans. So Bob Castley now is going to be county executive of Harper County, and then Michael Huff made a bid for county executive in Frederick County. Both members that I have very, very different policy views. Like we differ on policy probably 99% of the time. But I respected them because of their level of attention to detail and expertise on the issue matters. And especially in the committee, if they made good arguments, which they oftentimes did, then there's a chance that argument could prevail. And so people that paid attention to detail, went line by line, understood the scope of where things fit, is something it's hard to replicate, and it's something that's going to be sorely missed. Although we had policy differences, we were personal friends, and I respected the level of just work, quality of work they brought to it, and the level of dedication that they brought to making good policy. And ultimately, the thing that you got to remember is that we all want the same thing at the end of the day. We all want just to have a safer, more just, more equitable Maryland, a better place for all of us. We just have different ways of getting about it. But we're going to miss that level of expertise. And so, possible new members, we've got Dawn Guile coming in from Anne Arundel County. She's an attorney, brilliant attorney. Mary Delaney James, also a brilliant attorney. And some other folks, Bill Folden, who has a law enforcement background. Those are all potential, that's obviously, Senate President Ferguson's prerogative to who to put on the committee, but those are all potential new members. And so we'll try to hit the ground running as we start the new session, but we're gonna be missing, we'll miss Michael Hoff, and we'll miss Senator Castley, and maybe Jack Bailey, if he leaves, we'll miss those folks.
All right. Well, a lot of things to watch as the election shakes out in the new legislative session. Let's turn to some legislative issues, because there's a lot of hot ones, as there always are. So let's start with just, I believe yesterday or the day before, a bill that you had worked on kind of came up with its first report, the Independent Investigations Unit. So a big issue nationally about police involved shootings and so forth, and wanting to just make sure and get information out there, not prejudging what happened in a particular case, but rather just simply to make sure that we had all the information and it was public, so to create some transparency. Can you speak about kind of what's going on with that, how that all came about, and where we are today on it?
Sure. The Independent Investigative Unit, which is nested within the Office of the Attorney General, was born out of our police reforms in 2021. It was my bill that I pushed that really sought to have an independent review, independent investigations of officer-involved deaths that involved civilians. And obviously, because of the, what I would say is an inherent conflict where you have prosecutors and the police that they so often work with kind of investigating themselves, but then also responsible for making a decision as to whether to prosecute. So having the independence is something that's really important. Right now, that division only does the investigations. They then turn over that investigation to the local state's attorney in the jurisdiction in which the incident occurred, and then that state's attorney still has the ability to move forward with prosecutions. I personally want to make sure that, I have a bill that will have all of it nested within the Attorney General's office, meaning the prosecutorial authority nested within the Attorney General's office as well. So we'll see what happens with that. But the report that you mentioned came out yesterday, and I thought that it was an important step forward for not only members of the public, but for policymakers to understand some of the ground truth as to what's happening. And a lot of it, again, like you said, there was no prejudgment for the report. It's just information. Where did the incidents happen? What type of incidents were they? What did the people look like? What were the facts in the background? So it was a tremendous step forward. we've never had information like that synthesized in such an accessible way. The office has done a really good job, a thorough job in investigating and producing that information and making it available to the public. Obviously, the governor's office of crime prevention, youth and victim services, used to be GOCAP, has a report, but not at this level of granularity. And so I think it's a tremendous step forward for Marylanders to have access to that information. I will say that the report was also, lauded by members of the FOP and members of, people that are seeking more transparency, because none of the investigations warranted prosecution of officers. And so it showed that although these unfortunate incidents happened, there was no malfeasance and nothing was awry and nothing warranted prosecution. So, both sides are able to get something from this report.
Yeah, I think it's in transparency. I remember when you were putting this bill in, it's obviously makes a lot of sense to have this information out there so there's not misconceptions about what goes on. These are very challenging decisions on the spot with very dangerous individuals on the street. And so to have that kind of information was that kind of the goal of it, was to make sure that the public understood kind of the level of kind of the more specifics as to what happens rather than just the headlines of it.
100%. I mean, it's to understand this is a three-dimensional problem, and I think again, what Clyde Boatwright brought up is that, look, this showed that these are split-second decisions, life decisions that happen in a fluid environment, but being able to have some of the information behind it and full-throated analysis of exactly what happened is something that I think both sides of the reform efforts have been seeking and will get out of this report. The report was not something that was mandated by conscribed by the statute. It wasn't required. It was something that they did. It was above and beyond. But the reports on the website and the actual investigations and the public nature of it was. And so I think we've been given a real benefit of having that information publicly accessible and so easily accessible on the website and then through this report.
Okay. And I know that another bill of yours that did not move forward last year, but something that you're trying to tackle with challenging issue, which is the attraction and retention of police officers. It's a multifaceted problem, and it's statewide. And so I guess, can you speak to the legislation you're trying to push to try to help that issue, and what you think the chances are of that moving forward this year or in the next few years?
Sure. So obviously the reforms of 2021 were necessary, and I make I'm proud of the reforms that took place. But you have to also understand that everything has every action has a reaction. So like the pendulum swings a little bit, and as a result, I think you've got to look this problem in the eye. As a result of the reforms we made, and some of the rhetoric that some members of the public or some elected officials used, retention is down, and so is attracting people to come into the force. So I'll give you a little example in Montgomery County. Montgomery County is a county of 1.2 million plus people. Our last academy class was initially 13, but I think 9 graduated. So you're 9 new recruits that are going to go into the force for a county of 1.2 million plus. And then you've got people that are taking early options for retirement and leaving the state, frankly. So I'm very proud of the reforms, but you have to understand that there are consequences and reactions. Being able to attract and retain top flight officers is one of those things that we're now facing a problem. So the bill essentially creates a GI Bill style benefit for folks that are in service for a certain period of time, that they would have an educational benefit that they could either themselves seek a 4-year degree, for free on the state, or they could transfer that benefit after a period of time to their children. And that is to encourage officers to seek higher education. And if they have higher education, if they already attained that, then they can pass that benefit on to their children. And so it's something that I hope will pass this session. I'm optimistic about it. We got it out of committee last year. I think we'll do some tweaks, but I'm really, really encouraged by it. And I hope it'll attract and retain some of the members of the force that we so desperately need.
That's great. Well, we will definitely keep an eye on that legislation this year. Let's move on to a completely different topic, and that is an issue that I recall during the General Assembly we used to talk about almost every year, which is the whole kind of wear carry permitting process.
Yeah.
It's thrown into, I guess, some confusion for Maryland's law right now based on the Supreme Court decision. I think it was the Bruin decision.
Yeah.
And so essentially, am I right in saying that our law has essentially been declared unconstitutional at this point in time? Is that a little too strong? And what are we going to do now that the New York law, which was very similar to ours, has been declared unconstitutional? Where is Maryland, and where are we going from here on this issue?
Yeah, I think you're right. So it's probably too strong to say that the entire process is unconstitutional, but the good and substantial is definitely thrown out. I don't think there's any question about that. And that was what was substantially similar to the Bruin language in New York City. Now, the William Rounds, there's an unreported decision, William Rounds in Maryland, that I think actually is a really great primer on the process. And you were at the helm when we did this. So right, before this, before this decision came out, you would go through the Maryland State Police, and then if they declined, then you had an internal review, and then if that declined, then you'd go to the handgun permit review board, which we then did away with. But then you got another appeal, and you can go all the way up to the circuit court, and then the special court of appeals and the court of appeals, which is what William Rounds was doing. And I think that was a good primer on kind of how the process works. Right now, good and substantial is clearly gone. And what remains is whether you can still erect some of those initial requirements, like training requirements, mental health evaluations. Those things are all kind of in flux and being litigated right now in several states, and even in the Fourth Circuit. You've got 3 or 4 cases right now. I think in a related issue, but kind of separate from the wear carry issue, the assault weapons ban is being litigated, I think, today or tomorrow in Richmond. So our attorney general is going to be down there, fighting, in the next week or two on that. But so the issues that remain are, hey, what barriers can we erect to, for the qualification that the state police can do? Is it, extended background checks, mental health evaluations, more frequent renewal processes, requiring it every year instead of every 3 years, that type of thing. Second thing is the sensitive places. You've seen Montgomery County, for instance, has moved forward extending sensitive places. New York did that, and they've had a large amount of that has been thrown out already. So we, in the legislature, we're going to be looking to see what sensitive places we can expand. What does that mean? So already in statute, you've got things like daycare facilities, courthouses, hospitals, schools, those types of things are already in statute. But where can we expand the definition, and what are the constitutional limits based on the Bruin decision? So it's going to be an interesting debate. I think one of the things that the court gave us was that there has to be this new standard of, it has to be attenuated to a historical analog, and the test for what is a sufficient analog is not clear. So that's what's happening all throughout the country right now, from Tennessee to New York. You've got litigation working its way up through the courts, to the circuit. So it's going to be an interesting ride this session.
Do you anticipate there being a statute that's put into place on these different issues this year? So, sensitive areas, so like gun-free zones,
yeah.
Expansion. Is the idea to put together a statute and then kind of put it out there and see what the courts do with it after that?
That's right. So we're doing research now on, there are 2 kind of data banks. I think every town has one, and Duke University Law School has a significant data bank of of historical analogs and what regulations you can kind of attach to those analogs. And so we'll look to have that to create a very kind of meaty legislative history, so that when it does get challenged, we'll be able to, have some semblance of a defense. But yeah, that's exactly it. I think you're going to look for, there are 2 prongs. One is, where can we go for sensitive locations and spaces? And then 2 is, what other requirements can we constitutionally required for someone to get that permit in the first place, meaning the mental health and, the
So
training.
adding more to the very challenging issue to figure out the mental health aspect of that. It's like
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
danger to self or others, hard to distinguish that one.
you know
Always.
that as you passed our red flag law, which became a national model. But so, yeah, I mean, you know that. Yeah.
Very interesting issue. Well, another one that we're going to be looking at, big ticket issue for Maryland and the Judicial Proceedings Committee this year. Let's talk about another constitutional issue, another one that's going to be in JPR and having to do with another court decision, the Dobbs decision, and the whole issue of reproductive rights, abortion, and so forth, where Maryland has had a statute on the books for a long time. So there's really not a big issue about access to reproductive rights in the state of Maryland. So what happens in this legislative session, if anything, as it relates to the Dobbs decision?
It's always, you're right. It's good to point that out because it's a misnomer. People say we need to codify Roe. It's already, we've had that on the books in our Maryland Health General article for probably 2 decades, to maybe 2.5. Yeah. So I mean, that's one thing. What 2 things remain? One is to enshrine it in the Constitution. So a constitutional amendment, you could do that. And then also the second issue that arises is how do you protect women that are coming to Maryland to seek healthcare from out of state? And so you've got interesting things like, I've heard ideas from long arm statutes to extradition. We've looked at, there's a single person in the Attorney General's office that's responsible for all the extraditions in Maryland. I didn't know that. Sat down with the person and kind of tried to understand the process. So what can we do to prevent that? What can we do to protect people from criminal or civil liability, for performing abortions?
In other states.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's an interesting, I think that's where the efforts will go, is to basically protecting people that are coming to Maryland to seek healthcare, and then also to enshrine it in the Constitution. So I think the Speaker and the Senate President will have the constitutional amendment, and then you'll have people at various solutions to protect people that are coming to Maryland to seek healthcare.
Do you think that gets into the Constitution, or is that just kind of a statute that goes along with another statute? Okay, so it sounds like an interesting another big ticket issue, because it's challenging to figure out the federal, the state and federal interplay on that issue.
The federalism issue. I mean, you can't. I mean, that's a federal thing, right? I mean, you have to honor the extradition of if someone commits a crime in, let's say, Texas, and it's a crime in Texas, and they abscond to Maryland. We have to honor that. And that's not a Maryland, that's a federal thing. And so it'll be interesting.
Based on what, and I hate to throw this one at you because it's a new one as of like yesterday, but based on what the federal government did, or the Congress did yesterday on the issue of same-sex marriage, is there anything that we need to do here? And obviously we allow same-sex marriage in the state of Maryland. Is there anything kind of similarly that we need to do to protect individuals in other states? I haven't even read the bill from Congress, but is there anything kind of in a similar vein that we need to do on that issue? That's
fascinating. So, it's now that Congress has gone ahead and done it. I mean, I think, and even with bipartisan support, I think several Republican senators gone, and I think Steny Hoyer said that the House is going to take it up next Tuesday. So that's interesting. I don't know if that the same dynamic exists. Again, for the abortion issue, it's not about whether the crime was committed in Texas and then they come to Maryland. It's whether Texas makes coming to Maryland and seeking something that's legal in Maryland illegal in Texas. Do you know what I mean? So that's the more nuanced, interesting issue that I don't know how. I don't know if there's a clear answer to that.
It is interesting. There's that issue. There's recreational marijuana, which we're going to get to in a second. I mean, the state could do that as well. And, it is interesting to see how that would play out if states decide to take hard line on issues like this, where they make it illegal and we have it legal. So, yeah.
I mean, cannabis is, we'll get into it, but I mean, it's still Schedule 1. It's still federally, it's not legal. And so in terms of banking and possession, I mean, it's still federal crime. You get a different attorney general in there, you get a different, administration in there, you could have a completely different look as to what, the states that have legalized it, what that means in terms of, federal authorities going in and prosecuting. So
let's jump into that, since that's a good segue to another issue. I skipped over a few that I wanted to talk about, but we'll get back to them. Let's talk about cannabis. and the state, it's always been three tracks. There's the medical track, there's the criminal aspect or the decriminalization of cannabis and all that goes with that. And then there's what the voters just decided to do, which is to have legal recreational marijuana for adults. Where are we with that? It's because it's not all of a sudden legal in the state that you can't just go selling it at this point in time, which I think is a misnomer among some folks based on the referendum and the news that's come out of it. Where are we, and what happens next on this issue?
Well, I think it was interesting because this came up during the session. I mean, I was against the referendum. I think we should have just passed. We should have just done it through legislation. But because when you do a referendum, now it's in the Constitution, so that's interesting. But so what we did with the referendum, we obviously passed the bill to put it before the voters, which the voters overwhelmingly approved. So recreational industry is now legalized, but there's no framework. So there's no regulatory framework yet. The bill also further decriminalized and expanded some expungement opportunities. So the personal use amount was increased to 1 ounce, which is, I had to ask someone like what that was. And that's a pretty significant amount. Yeah, I mean, that's like kind of like a brick or something. I mean, it's a brick. And then we've, for the decriminalized 2.5 ounce, I think up to 2.5 ounces. So for personal use, so you wouldn't have possession with intent to distribute. So, and then what we've done is we've allowed for expungement right now for those people that have been, convicted with the 1 ounce or less. And then for 2.5 and more, instead of having to wait 10 years after your conviction to seek expungement, you now can go down to 3 years, and then you can go ahead and try to get it expunged or apply to get it expunged. So, some significant progress there, but we have not developed a regulatory framework. It's not, you still can't do it in public. I think there are a lot of issues with, going to work or driving, our ability to test for it, whether someone's impaired on the roadside is still lagging. It still lags. And so there are a lot of significant hurdles on the regulatory and the criminal front that remain.
So what's the plan for this session? I know that that's not necessarily your committee or just your committee, but just for those who don't follow this as closely as some others, like what does that look like this year in terms of who's doing the regulatory framework? What are the issues and barriers, and kind of what role does JPR you think have in this moving forward?
Well, much like the medical cannabis industry, it's hard, the licensure issue is going to fall on who can qualify, right? Who has the ability to finance an operation and who has the technical expertise to make it happen. So we're going to have to figure out how many licenses we're going to restrict for the recreational industry, if at all. I think you should. Because if you unleash it, then there's no incentive for people to kind of invest money and refine the process. And you got to have like this kind of a crazy marketplace where no one's making any money. And then the quality of the product goes down and it's everywhere, and then you get the black market issues. And so you kind of got what you got in Colorado. So I think the tough decisions are going to be, how are you going to restrict the licenses, and how are you going to do that in an equitable fashion? And that's where you'll have significant players like the Black Caucus will have to play a significant role there. And we're going to have to do some disparity studies and ensure that we're moving forward in an equitable fashion. It makes sense, makes economic sense for the quality of the product and for the ability for the marketplace to grow, because no one's going to invest in this industry if they're not going to be able to make some money on it, obviously. But you need people that are diverse, but that have the resources to make it happen. So it's a very difficult conversation, frankly, given the historical inequities for criminal prosecution of, in particular, African-American men. So like, it's a tough conversation to have. And that's what's going to have to happen.
Are you optimistic that that legislation and a regulatory framework, because I can tell you that I remember when the medical, where we are today was not where we were when the bill got passed so many years ago. It started, first the universities were going to grow it, which was a ridiculous idea. And then, I mean, it took years and years of failure, quite frankly, in the state for it to grow to where it is today. I mean, almost 20 years of that. So I guess the question is, how optimistic are you? I know you're an eternal optimist, but how optimistic are you that we will have a regulatory framework sometime in the near future on this issue?
it's gonna be an iterative process. It's gonna take years. I mean, I think we've got the lessons learned from the medical rollout, and then also even sports betting. I mean, we have a lot of lessons learned in terms of how to equitably distribute licensing and how to do that. But it's going to take years, and especially now that even the medical market has experienced a lull in output for a number of reasons. But and then you're going to open up and unleash a recreational market. So there are a lot of countervailing forces for us to move fast here. So I'm not optimistic that it's going to happen anytime soon. I think there are a lot of recent lessons learned that we can draw from to make sure that we do it right, but it's going to take time.
All right. Well, one we will keep our eyes on. All right, let's move into a pretty controversial issue, and one that's been around for as many years as I've been in the General Assembly. I mean, I remember a bill about this my very first year when I was in the House Judiciary. Delegate Wilson has a very compelling personal story, very tragic personal story from when he was a child, and has pushed forward on an issue. It's been in the news. The Attorney General did a big study, and just to be open, I have other clients that have different issues on this particular issue, but it's an interesting legal issue, and that's the issue of doing away retroactively with statutes of limitations, statute of repose, and so forth. For those who have no idea what it is that I'm introducing here, can you talk to the bill that I'm speaking of, kind of what's been your experience with it and where you think we are on this issue?
So yeah, the bill's been given the moniker of like the Hidden Predator Act, so it's a bill that I know that Delegate Wilson has a compelling personal story in it, and I want to commend him for his work on this and his tenacity, frankly, over the several years. Look, in 2017, this bill came before the General Assembly, and the legislature, I think it was 2017, the legislature said, look, there's a statute of repose, and then we're going to allow folks that had, experienced sexual abuse to have basically a look back window. And that window gave you essentially to you were 38 years old, right? Or to 20 years after or the age of majority, which is 18. And so it gave you a little bit of window, and then it implemented something called a statute of repose, which is different than a statute of limitations. Statute of repose is something you find mostly in construction law. I'd never heard of a statute of repose, honestly, before this, before like maybe even last year. And to my understanding, it's essentially the clock starts when the incident actually occurred, not when you knew or should have known. So it's kind of like you see this in construction law, because let's say a builder puts in your wall, and instead of filling it with insulation, they fill it in with bubble gum, and 50 years later you figure it's gone. The statute of repose says, look, like whatever from when that bubble gum was put in your wall, that's when the clock starts, not from when you hammered down, you're trying to hang a picture and you knocked through your wall and you saw bubble gum, not 50 years later when that happened. So the controversy is that a lot of these people that are coming forward have been barred from seeking relief because of the statute of repose and the statute of limitations that are also imposed in the bill. And so my understanding is that Delegate Wilson has put in a bill that would eviscerate that and kind of open up that liability so the victims then can seek relief going back however many years, no matter what. And it's very controversial because the stories are compelling and tragic, coupled with the Attorney General's recent report that shows that the problem is extremely pervasive, with actual constitutional confinement. So over the last 5 years, we've sought Attorney General's opinions on this issue, and they have been very clear that once a statute of repose is in place and once statute of repose is in place, those rights are vested. So like it's very difficult emotionally and politically to navigate this, because I think we have clear guidance on the law, but not so but a very controversial and compelling and tragic issue on the other side. And so we're going to have to figure something out and let the courts decide.
So essentially just let the So essentially, Delegate Wilson's bill, and he's been courageous in coming forward
Yeah.
with his own personal story, absolutely courageous. The bill would do away with the statute of limitations retroactively and essentially create a window so that going back however many years, you could sue for something that you've long since lost your statute of limitations. And I guess so the idea would be to pass legislation, even though the courts have said that that's unconstitutional, so to essentially allow the courts to take a look at this the way that they have in other states.
That's right. I mean, I think and you've kind of squinted towards where we're going here, right? So you do that, but then where else does that apply in terms of what does the statute of limitations mean if it doesn't mean anything? What does the statute of repose mean if it doesn't mean anything? And where else in the law will you apply that same rationale? And so you see where we're going. And so it's a very difficult, squishy issue that none of us have wanted to kind of, we all want to see the victims get relief and everything that they're entitled to, but you do run into the barriers of the law. So it's tough.
Right. Well, I will not push you any further on this issue. I know it's a very challenging one, but on behalf of drunk driving victims, we're watching just in case they lost their statute of limitations too. So
it's a valid point, man. So I mean, there you go. Yeah.
So it should be an interesting issue, and we will. And I know one that is very difficult politically and morally and all the rest to wrestle constitutionally to wrestle with. So we'll be following it. Let's move on to another one, maybe one that a little less controversial, but one that has been around forever as well, and that is the election of circuit court judges. And just to set it up for those who may not know, in Maryland, we have elections only for one level of our judiciary, which is the circuit court, district court, courts of appeal. Everybody else is appointed for various terms, going through a process of Senate confirmation or retention elections for the upper levels. But circuit court judges continue to be elected by the voters. Where are we on this issue? Is there going to be some changes to it, or is this just kind of the conversation that keeps on giving?
No, it's funny. So I first ran into this when I ran for office the first time in 2014, 15. And I was standing at a poll during early voting from sun up to sundown, and there were judges standing next to me and members of the bar who had pending matters in front of the judge were there with the judge's campaign shirt on, campaigning for that person. And I just could not believe it. And so from that point forward, I've always thought that I thought that we should do away with the judicial elections for the circuit court. Now, obviously, retention elections are a little different because you vote for yourself. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever lost a retention election, but so yes, what the problem teases out is the historical nature of appointments and diversity on the bench. And I think that's no more, I think a keen example can be found than in Baltimore City. And that's because that's a lot of the case studies kind of come from Baltimore City, where African Americans in particular never ascended to the bench, but through an election, and because they weren't getting appointed by the governors at that point in time. Now the data tell us that the bench is more diverse in terms of ethnicity and gender than ever before, and frankly, the last governor, who was a Republican, has appointed the more diverse bench than his predecessor in terms of party affiliation and gender and in ethnicity. And so the trends are just completely in a different opposite. We got a little friend there. That's right. The trends are completely different than they were historically. So the initial arguments for having elections I don't think hold as much water. And I think a lot of people have evolved on this issue. Judge Dumais, circuit court judge in Montgomery County, has assembled and led a task force to review this issue. And I think they held their last meeting just yesterday, actually, to review and then produce recommendations. I'm optimistic that we'll take action on this. We've got a lot of vigorous support, bipartisan support, frankly, to take action on this. And I think that we'll probably see something in the next 4 years.
Okay. And you think that so your prediction on this issue is that they will do away with the circuit court elections and make them more like the district court?
Something, or some sort of a, involve the General Assembly more heavily in the process, and so that you still have some sort of public check and kind of a check there and a balance there through the Judicial Nominations Committee in the Maryland State Senate. So I think you're going to look at some sort of a different solution than an election, but I don't know what it's going to look like. But I think we'll see some semblance of a reform in the next 4 years.
Well, we're making news here on the MSBA.
I think you'll see it. I think you'll see it. I'm confident you'll see it.
That's a huge issue. It's been around for as long as I can remember, just the debate about whether it's good or bad to have the public involved. Does it make more accountability, diversity? And then there was always the issue of the voters because of the quirkiness of our system. Independent voters often get disenfranchised. And so there's always been a lot of controversial and problematic issues with this. So that kind of change would be dramatic.
Yeah, I just never thought that especially, the circuit court, I mean, it's it's critical, kind of pipeline for justice. I just should never be subject to the political whims of an election season. And so it's just such a critical body that I thought it should be insulated, but so we'll see.
All right. Well, looking forward to seeing that. We don't have a ton of time left, but there was another issue that I know is important to members of the bar, and that's the issue of judicial transparency. And I know that was an issue that came before JPR. You were involved in it. Just to make it a broad question, what did we do and where are we on that issue?
So we basically said that the circuits would have to report, and it would be anonymized by judge. The individual judges would not be identified, but that you'd see trend analysis from different circuits or different regions of the state as to the disposition of certain cases. And so you get more granular information in that respect. It didn't go as far as the governor wanted to, because the governor wanted to kind of name and understand which judges were, giving lenient sentences or letting people go. And so it wasn't as granular as the governor wanted, but I thought we struck the right balance between getting the information and not identifying a particular judge, because you wouldn't want them to change their philosophy based on political pressure or public pressure. It should be done on a case-specific, fact-intensive analysis, not on politics or pressure. Another problem we ran into is that some of these regions are just smaller, so you only have one sitting circuit judge. So it's a little, it's more difficult than it looks, but we'll continue to get that information in the next couple of years and see if it's granular enough and if other reforms are necessary in the future.
Okay. Let me just open this up to you, because we are running out of time here, and I want to be cognizant of your busy schedule. Let me ask you this, just as an open question. We've talked about a number of things: guns and crime and cannabis and statutes of limitations, and so some civil law. What else is coming this year? We're at the start of a 4-year session. Kind of the world is before your committee. You can kind of chart your course for the next 4 years as the chair of that committee. Kind of what else have we not spoken about that maybe it's not this session, but kind of your focus as the chairman, things you'd like to see accomplished in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years?
So a lot of I think it's important to do this at the beginning of every legislative term, and so we're gonna have a retreat for our committee once we get our full throat. So we've got a retreat already scheduled. Chief Judge Getty is going to be one of the speakers, and I think Senator Raskin's going to be another speaker to kind of come in and give a little flavor. But the lines of effort, what I call them, kind of the priorities for the committee, are developed through a couple of things. One is vision of the chair and the members. What are their personal priorities? I tell everyone always to think about why you ran, and then develop your personal legislative agenda based on that, and don't be a 60-minute legislator. And what I mean by that is, you sit on the couch on Sunday night and 60 minutes comes on and you're like, oh, I got to get a bill for that. I got to get a bill for that. That doesn't lend itself to thoughtful and deliberative strategic thinking in terms of where you want to go legislatively. So you obviously, like, things happen, you got to address them, but don't live that way. And second is understand that all the interest groups that give you bills have grant money that's funding their priorities. And then that interest group that gives you a bill is then, giving you that idea to run with, which is funded by their grant dollars. So just understand the streams of influence when, your interest groups come in. So it's important for you to have that vision. All that said, I think, over the course, public safety is going to continue to be a big deal. Guns, illegal guns. We've done a lot of great things on gun reform, but illegal guns and repeat of offenders with those guns. Those are so gun trafficking and repeat offenders. For public safety is going to be a line of effort. Obviously, Dobbs, Bruin, those are other lines of effort. Juvenile justice reform is going to be a continued line of effort. And moving forward, and then we've got some of the tort reform that we'll continue with. So you've got 4 or 5 major lines of effort that I've encouraged people to take a long-term strategic view of where you want to be in the next 4 years, so you can work about that goal every session, get a couple things done each session, and then at the end of your term, you look back and you've made some sort of systemic reform. So we'll continue to refine the lines of effort, but those are the 4 or 5 things I think they're going to be big in the next 4 years.
Right. Well, great. Senator Smith, I just want to thank you so much for taking this time with the Maryland State Bar Association. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and I think this has been a really good conversation about a wide-ranging, legislative agenda for the next 4 years. It's great to have you here. It's great to see you. And I just want to, on behalf of the 20 some odd thousand members of the Maryland State Bar Association, thank you so much for taking time on the Coffee and Conversations.
Well, I appreciate it. Always a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to working with you all for the next session and the next 4 years.
All right. Shally, back to you.
Thank you all for joining us. And if you'd like to see this session, prior sessions, and what's coming up, please visit our advocacy website, and you can view all of the sessions there and see what's coming up. Thanks again.
Have a great morning.